Okay, so welcome to the third part of my introduction to benchmarking presentation with a subtitle From Academic Studies to Managerial Advice. The first part we talked about traditional benchmarking, some of the challenges of traditional benchmarking, and we talked about a more appropriate and modern and model-based benchmarking approach, where we try to describe all the inputs coming into the process, all the outputs getting out of the process, all the conditions that affect this transformation of inputs into outputs. And we talked specifically also about two of the most important techniques, namely stochastic frontier analysis and DEA. In the second part, we showed you some of the software that can be used to support benchmarking studies, and particularly applied benchmarking studies. We have another lecture where we'll go through the R-based benchmarking package in not full, but some details. But in this, the third part of this initial presentation, I want to focus on a whole lot of application that we have undertaken in the last several years to give you an idea about how benchmarking studies can actually help decision makers make informed decision in a data-driven way. So let's move to the slides. So applications. I'm going to show you a bunch of applications from energy, water, hospitals, education, and so on, listed down here from various countries. But most of basically these applications are applied benchmarking projects. So some of them have started with an academic article and we have added an applied part of it. Some of them are not even documented in applied in the academic papers, but more like in consultancy reports and similar outlets. But because what I want to focus on here is how we can use benchmarking not only to get an efficiency score of different companies and to rank them, but to support learning inside these companies, to support decision-making inside these companies, and support incentive provision inside these companies, or incentive provision for these companies by their shareholders or by a regulator or by a authority of sorts. So this really represents how you can go from research. So all of these studies are done on careful research, but what we want to focus on here now is the applied side of it. So how can it be used by real decision makers? So let's start with a bunch of studies we've done in education. We studied secondary schools in Denmark. We studied high schools in Denmark. We studied vocational colleges in Denmark. And we also was part actually at some point of a EU project on universities in Europe. But if we look at the secondary school, the high schools and the vocational colleges, this analysis is actually quite demanding because we have, before we can do an analysis, we have to create some good data. Okay, we have data on the cost and the teachers and what the teachers are spending their time on. That's all very fine. And we then also have some measures of the performance of the kids in terms of their grades. But the problem is that how a child performs really depend a lot on the socioeconomic background of the child. So the first thing we do is we correct for their socioeconomic backgrounds using register data. So for 60,000 students, we take the grades they get and we try to, first of all, to explain that by the father's education, the mother's education, the age of the parents, whether they're divorced or not, what kind of education they have, what kind of income they have, because that's possible in Denmark because we have these detailed register data and we're allowed to combine them. So in that way, we can basically explain, it turns out like 75% of the variation in grades of a child is basically explained not by the school, but by the background of that child. And so what we want to do is we want to explain the rest of the variation in the grades or in the performance, and we call that the ability of the schools to lift the student academically. And once we have those as output, then we can then combine them with results about the inputs or data about the inputs being used. So for example, down here, I have an example of up here actually, you see how the performance, these are the grades girls get in spelling and math, and boys get in spelling and math at these standardized tests. And what you see is that depending on the mother's income, when that increases, then the children also get higher and higher grades. And you also will see that the girls are doing better than the boys in general. So there's a lot of things we can explain in terms of the socioeconomic background of the children. But using those as output, the remaining variation in grades and in performance as output, and then these different resources as input, we can now do a benchmarking analysis. And that's what we've done. And we might, for example, for a given school, show that down here we have something about what kind of teachers, how many hours the teachers use in class, and how much they use for administration and for coordination and for group meetings and stuff like that. So how they spend their time and how much teacher time there is per student. And then we have two outputs, the blue ones, it's hard to see on the slide, but it's how much the schools are able to lift the kids in the sciences, and also in the humanitarian, like languages and the humanities subjects. So this is how we do it, and then we can basically, for a given school, say, okay, you should have been able to lift them more in physics or in math, for example. And if you want to do that, you can go and look at these specific peers that we mentioned here. If you also want to lift them in English and in history and stuff like that, maybe you should go and look at some other schools. You can prioritize what should be your strategy. Do you want to emphasize the sciences or the humanitarians? So this is a way that we try to give a tool to the schools. We actually gave all the Danish 1,600 schools got access to this system so that they could evaluate themselves and then figure out what they wanted to accomplish, and then figure out some peers from which they could learn, and they could see the impact of changing the relationship between, for example, time in front of the class and time for group work and time for coordination between teachers and stuff like that. So that was the idea of these studies, big studies behind that. We have done a lot of work on totally different area, namely waterworks, for the Danish Water and Wastewater Association. We have basically developed 11 models for clean water and 13 for wastewater, and we focused on different things like OPEX, CAPEX, administration, energy efficiency. We also implemented the model that the regulator is using to evaluate the companies, so that they could basically play against that. So, so this is illustrated here, and it has been used actively for these companies to learn from each other. They're actually, in general, willing to share best practices and tell how they've done certain things differently. They also use these systems for strategic planning. A lot of them have used it to, or some of them have used it to develop reports that is then being discussed in the board of directors. And for example, if there's a discussion whether you should merge with a neighboring water works, you can calculate the gains from that in this system. And then you have like a data-based foundation for making those decisions. And it is also being used actively to see how, if I change something, how the regulator's evaluation of me will change, and therefore the revenue cap that I'm allowed to keep, how that will change. So it's used sort of strategically to play against, or can be used strategically to play against the regulator, you can say. So that's waterworks. We've done works on hospitals in the Netherlands and a little bit in the UK. The idea of hospitals is normally that you have a lot of DRGs, diagnosis relating groupings on the output side, and we then group them in maybe 6 or 8 groups, those services being provided, and then we have some cost or some human resources being spent on the input side, and then we do DEA and stochastic frontier analysis. And then we develop these systems that can be used both for individual hospitals to figure out what they could do better, how they can learn from other hospitals, how they can reallocate resources between maybe doctors and nurses, or one type of cost against another type of cost. And it's also been used in the Netherlands at some point. When we developed it, it was also for the regulator to monitor the sector, and also to evaluate what could be the gains from a merger. So if 2 hospitals in the Netherlands wanted to merge, the regulator could calculate, okay, what's the likely effect of doing that? And if there's a huge efficiency gain from that, of course, it's a good idea to allow it. But if it's mainly some effects that could be accomplished by just learning each other's practices, or by collaborating instead of merging entirely, then maybe they would like to go for that, so that you still keep a large number of hospitals available for the people living in these different areas. So another one we've done, as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of studies on electricity and gas networks for different entities, and in most cases it sort of is basically we do analysis, and then we make a report, and that report is used as the basis for setting revenue caps, or setting the allowed incomes to these companies. But in some cases we also put it into an exactly benchmarking framework, and then the regulator can play with that and can better understand the evaluation of the individual entities that he's regulating. And even in some cases, for example, in Iceland, they wanted the individual companies to be allowed to use the model, so that they could also figure out better ways to provide their services. An early one we did was about the US credit unions. It was a challenging project because it was a very large data set. So we had some 10,000 plus credit unions. We had data from 6 periods for all these credit unions, and in each period we had more than 700 variables. So a huge data set, and one of the challenging things was actually to develop a software that was working sufficiently fast so that it would be worthwhile for people to play with it. We used in this case a variant of free disposability hull that I mentioned in the beginning. We allowed for a little bit of upscaling and downscaling. And the idea was basically that we wanted to support the credit unions, Credit Union National Association in the US, their consultants. We wanted to give them a tool they could use to guide the individual credit unions. And we also wanted to give individual credit unions, or CUNA could decide if they want to give the individual credit unions access to the system. Another study is about, at the municipality level, we was asked at some point to do an analysis for the Danish Productivity Commission to give an idea about what could possibly be the efficiency gains or the productivity development of the public sector. So we looked at the Danish municipalities. There's around 100 of those. And we developed measures of the service levels in the different municipalities and the efficiency of the different municipalities. One of the complications of doing that is that a municipality provides a lot of different services. They run libraries in Denmark, they maintain the roads, they maintain the parks, they take care of the elderly, they run the schools. So they do a lot of different and not very comparable things. So we had to use a total of 47 indicators. And then we sort of output indicators. And then if we have only 100 municipalities and 47 indicators, outputs, basically output indicators, then everyone will be special in some way. And if we then did DEA, for example, then everyone will look efficient. So we imposed a little bit more structure on the problem by introducing weight restrictions. One of the tools, one of the more advanced DEA stuff you can do, which we will cover in a later lecture. But the idea was basically to say that you cannot say that the only important thing is, for example, to maintain the roads. It might also be important to take care of the elderly or to care of the school children and to have a library service. So basically what we said was that, okay, if you spend, let's say 30% of your budget on a given activity, then that activity must have some importance to you, and maybe it must have the importance is maybe between 15% and 60%. So you don't know exactly how important it is. It's not reflected directly in the budget, but the budget must have some information about the relative importance of the different services. So using that approach, we imposed some weight restrictions, and that allowed us to evaluate the municipalities in this case. And we would come up with some good estimates of both the service levels, but also what are the saving potentials in the municipality sector in Denmark. We did that at the municipality level, but then we also did it at 3 individual subparts of the municipality activity, namely the biggest one, which are children's services, schools, and then taking care of the elderly. That's the main budget parts of municipalities in Denmark. That led us to an estimate of what could be saved at the national level in the municipality sector. But then we also used this whole framework. I mean, there's years of analysis that went into a study like this. So we also used that to develop individual reports for the municipalities. So that they could study. They got like a 30-page report if they asked for it, where we studied in details how they could improve the different service areas and who they could possibly learn from and so on. So that was a successful story on the municipality level. Then we have a bunch of projects here. I will do them relatively fast. We have projects on manufacturing industry. We have something about, let's just take this one and then the next we can take a little bit faster. So one set of projects, one project was about gain from automation in manufacturing. So the use of robots and other automated processes. So what we used is like a model where you could assume that you can automate different parts of your production process. We work with sort of production engineers how to describe a production process. So you could automate in the production, in the feeding of material, in the packing, in the processing, and so on. So there are different processes you can, 6 or 7 different processes you could try to automate. And then the consequences of automate can also be multiple. It can impact the amount of material that goes to waste, the quality of the products being produced, the value added per employee, and so on. So we had like multiple automation on the input sides and multiple consequences on the output side. And then that was the conceptual framework, and then we collect the data from 560 firms. Each of them was interviewed for 2 hours. And then we developed a software where you can go in, you tell which, how large your company is, what industry it belongs to, and then the automation level you have. And then you get out a report that tells you that maybe you are here in terms of the waste, but if you were to increase the automation, the first one here is automation in the processing of production of the product. This one here is the automation of the packing things. And you see, for example, in the packing, they are sort of in the middle. They have automated some of the procedures, but not all of them. But if they were to automate all of them, they could reduce the waste from the red level here down to this blue level. And if they were to give up some of the automations, they would then increase the waste product up to this level here. So in this way, we developed a model about the relationship between optimization and different output indicators, and then we gave people the possibility of getting a tailored report about, given your situation, given your size of a company, given your industry, and given your level of optimization, what is the likely consequences of automating more at various points in your production process. We did something similar in terms of benchmarking, to what extent they were using lean management techniques, to what extent they were decentralizing decision-making, using autonomous work groups and stuff like that, the extent they use KPI-based management, and we also benchmarked other aspects of the firm's operation, but the main thing was this impact of automating. Just threw in these other things to make it more interesting for the users. We've done some work on family firms. The big challenge in the family firm is that when the guy creating the company it's getting older, he has to somehow make sure that this company lives on, and he has different things to decide. Should he try to bring in external managers? Should he try to bring in external capital? Or should he rely only on family members to manage the company and only family capital? And it all depends on what kind of values is in the family, what kind of heritage, what kind of connections. We measure different aspects, different assets for the company, and some of the roadblocks that a family might face, both internally from the market and the industry, from the institutional setting. And so we basically ask them a bunch of questions like that, and based on that, we give some advice about what should be their natural next step and what should they try to consider in terms of continuation of this company. Here's another study where we also looked again at issues like how a company managed, how are they organized, and we try to benchmark that. It's a little bit the same as this manufacturing study I had before. It's just a different client. What is interesting in some of these studies is actually that we don't really benchmark the efficiency. We kind of just compare the actions taken by those companies, because in many cases that can actually be quite inspiring. We don't necessarily need a model about that says that you get so and so much out of having performance-based payments for your CEO. It's just interesting for many companies to know that in this sector, only 30% of companies, the CEO has a salary level that really depends on his performance in a given year. So we do benchmark a lot on the actual actions taking place. Innovation is one of the projects we're running right now, or we're about to finish right now. It is we benchmark how innovative different companies are in terms of developing new products, in terms of developing new processes, in terms of marketing initiatives, and in it should actually be economic organizational innovation also here. Economic performance, we also have that, but that's another thing. So the idea is that you fill out how you describe what your situation is, and then you get an idea about whether you are falling way behind other companies in your size group and your industry, or whether you're actually doing quite well, or you're maybe you might even learn that you're among the most innovative companies. So it is a question of how well are we doing compared to others, but also we estimate what can you gain by becoming more innovative, and how can you become more innovative. One of the tools you can use there is to employ more people with higher education. That tends to increase innovation. So you can we have a model that sort of shows what is the likely gain of employing more larger fraction of the workforce has a longer education. So that's innovation. And then another one, again, benchmarking actual performance is about management practices. So again, what kind of management tools are you using? Are you using performance-based payments? Are you measuring performance? Are you giving incentives based on these measured performances? How much are you relying on decentralized decision-making? We're sort of benchmarking how they operate their firms, how are firms operating. That's basically what we benchmark. And that is related also to this there's a big initiative in the US and the World Bank basically now that are called the World Management Survey Organization. So actually, if you're looking for data about how companies are actually run, and also some studies about the consequences of running them with one technique or another, one style or another, that's a very good place to look. You can download data there also. What we do in this project is that we have asked a lot of companies about these questions, and then we sent them a report telling them that how they are in terms of their management style, their performance style, the incentive index, and the autonomy index. And we also give them more details about, for example, these are different things that the performance-based payment can depend on. So you get an idea about how many companies are relying on the financial accounts, how many are relying on subjective information in the board of directors, what kind of indicators are being used in the performance-based payment schemes, for example. That can be useful and inspirational information for companies. We did a study at some point for the Danish Ministry of Social Affairs. They were interested to see if we could really benchmark social services. And they wanted to know the level of service against social groups, and also the efficiency by which different municipalities are providing those services. There were sort of three groups: drug addicts, brain damaged adults, and then mentally vulnerable youngs. And again, like in the school, we did a lot of register-based analysis to figure out, okay, we had three, typically in these studies, we had like three indicators. So what's the probability of being in work? What's the probability, like if you're a drug addict, what is the probability that you get a job? What's the probability that you are under some kind of education? And what's the probability that you stay out of crime? And then we could calculate those probabilities and how the municipality could impact those probabilities. Again, a lot of these large variation in these probabilities really depend on the socioeconomic background. So we needed to correct for that. For example, are you a married drug addict? Then you have different probabilities of being on education and staying out of crime than if you are non-married drug addict. Do you have children, for example? That also has a positive impact on certain things. So we removed all the impact of those socioeconomic factors because they were not directly related to the municipality. And then the variation in these probabilities that was left, we attributed to the municipality, and then we could link that to the resources being spent. And in this way, we could benchmark the social services being provided by different municipalities and the efficiency of those. And again, we developed individualized reports that the individual municipality could get. They could get a report saying that you are doing so and so. If you want to improve if you want to get more drug addicts, for example, in work, maybe go and look at these three municipalities that have been very successful in that. If you want to focus more on education, then this is some good, interesting peers. And if you want to keep your drug addicts out of crime, this is a good place these are good municipalities to learn from. So we gave them sort of individualized report like that. We also done benchmarking in housing associations for the Danish social housing sector. You can benchmark at the organizational level or at the individual housing complex. Again, these are a huge data set because we have like 15,000 well, we have 15,000 complex year combinations basically, and for each of them we have different KPIs. How much do you spend on maintaining and the green area and the buildings, and what kind of maintenance do you need to do, and how much, what are the resources used to do this maintenance. So in this case, again, the idea is to learn. And so basically you log in as either an organization or as a specific housing complex, and then you can learn. You get an idea, maybe, for example, down here, I'm located here in the red. This is a KPI, which is like cleaning. How much does it cost to clean per square meter of housing? And there you see I'm in the colored bar, the non-blue bar, and I have a relatively high cleaning cost. So there's many housing complexes that have lower cleaning costs, namely those that are down here. And we've made it possible that you could actually look at the identity of those. So you can press one of these bars, and then you can see which are these housing complexes, so that you could learn from them. So you can always see, in this case, the idea was to develop a feature where you can see firms that are housing complexes that are doing better than you, but you can't see those that are doing worse than you, because we didn't want to scapegoat any of them. So that was the idea of this project, or that's still running actually. Let me finally mention a project on forestry that we're doing, still doing. We're about to finish. It's an EU-funded project. Here we want to benchmark forestry operations. So you have these harvesters driving around in the forest, cutting down a lot of trees and removing the tree from the forests. You have machines for that also. And we would like to benchmark those operations, and you can do that with different perspectives. Again, you could do it for the individual machine, you can do it even for a given operator of a machine. Then you can do it for a given machine that might be operated by different persons over the course of the day, and you can do it for a group of machines that some machine owner maybe has. So at the machine fleet level. You could also benchmark these operations from the point of view of the forest owner. So he might want to he's interested in what goes on in his forest, what the subcontractors are able to take out of the forest, and you can go down at specific sites inside the forest. So here you see, for example, some people have been harvesting in a given forest here, and you see these are different stems, so the size of these woods that you've been cut down, what is the volume of them, and you can see that you have some that are really small, and then you have some trees that have a lot of volume, relatively large volume, and then you have some really huge one out here. So that's one of the ways that the forest owner would like to know what is actually being harvested in my forest. You can also see how a given tree is cut down into what kind of assortments, into stuff that can be used for timber or stuff that can be used only for paper pulp, or maybe even for burning. We also have screenshots where we describe for the individual machine how does it spend its time, how much time does it actually cut trees, how much time does it spend going from being transported around in the forest, how much time does it spend for maintenance, and how much break time is there for lunch and stuff like that. So there's a lot of different screens you can see inside this system that gives these information back to the fleet owner, machine fleet owner, and also to the forest owner. And the cool thing when it's all working is that we're getting this data in real time and automated over the internet. So it means that you log in, you can always see what has been happening in the last couple of days in your forest, or what your machines have been doing. And then, of course, we need a lot of possibilities to filter. So you'll want to look at a given time frame, time window, and a given operator, a given site you want to focus on. We have even GPS of individual trees. Is enormous amounts of data that are being collected by these machines. So we basically want to make that information available in a relevant way to the forest owner and the machine owners. And we also wanted to allow them to learn best practices by comparing different operators, or by comparing different machines of different machine fleets with each other and different forest sites with each other. So that's a big EU project we're involved in. So to sum up on this rather long presentation, let's just state a few facts. We first discussed traditional benchmarking. We saw that it was flawed, this KPI-based analysis, because it assumes constant return to scale. It ignores substitution between inputs and outputs. And it also ignores this allocation between different processes. So therefore, there's a risk that it will lead to bad targets and misleading targets to strive for. It's much better to use what I call modern benchmarking, which is model-based. So we try to make a comprehensive model of the transformation of multiple inputs to multiple outputs under the influence of multiple contextual variables. And if you want to do that, not just for a paper, you can make it available, these kind of results and these kind of frameworks available as a learning lab for real world decision makers, if you put it into some kind of interactive benchmarking framework. So that's basically what we've seen. We illustrated that in a lot of examples also. So in terms of, as a message to the researcher, I would like to say that in my perspective, a researcher typically spend a lot of energy estimating advanced models on extensive data set. Just think of the stuff we did with Danish schools. I mean, we spent years analyzing individual children, how they perform and how that depends on the socioeconomic background. And then we could publish that. That's very interesting. You see, for example, what's the cost of your academic performance, of your parents being divorced, for example. It's all interesting, but the problem is that a lot of this, oftentimes some of these publications have very few readers. It's still worthwhile to do it for sure, but it still has relatively few readers. And the way we use these results and how industry learns from these results is basically by the fact that we train the next generation of people working in these organizations. If you take now the consultant's perspective, we tend, when we work as consultants, to spend relatively little energy. We may estimate a relatively simple model. Oftentimes we have limited data. And then we share that extensively with business world, and we charge a good price for that sometimes. So what I'm kind of suggesting that academics should try to do is to find sort of a midway. Whenever they've done a study and spent maybe a year doing a study, they should ask themselves, could this be relevant to the entities that we have studied? So it's like if you have to explain to you at a family dinner, you have to explain to your uncle what your research could be used for. You could say that, okay, in your organization, my research shows that if you were to change this and this and this, then maybe you could have a higher value added, or you can waste less resources or less material in your production process, stuff like that. So ask if anyone that of the evaluated could learn something useful from your analysis, and then try to make it accessible through some kind of interactive benchmarking framework. And in Denmark, there's been a saying that we want to make more use of research. So basically going from pure research to invoices is kind of has been popular among the politicians. So this is actually one of the ways that you can do some of that. Let me just mention at the very end that this might all sound nice and interesting, but of course we have to admit that we have limited knowledge of whether it actually helps firms to know how they perform. So that's really the question. What are the effects of making such benchmarking studies available to real world users? So how can we do that? We can ask, is it used? That's the first thing. Do people actually try these systems that we developed? And the answer to that is yes. The next question is, does it have an effect on behavior? That's harder to evaluate, but I mean, we have anecdotal evidence at least. And then the last thing is, does this changed behavior lead to the desired outcome? And that's, of course, much more difficult to evaluate. We do know, for example, from the water industry that it is used. They use it to figure out which processes to focus on, which companies to merge with or collaborate with. And they use it also, as I mentioned, to play the regulation. So it is used for sure. And they also have anecdotal evidence that it actually improves stuff, but that's much more difficult to evaluate. So actually, we were involved in designing a control experiment where we had like 4,000 small and medium-sized enterprises, and then we were split in two groups, one getting access to these kind of tools and another one not getting access to it. And then the idea was we wanted to follow them over 3 years and see whether the treatment group were performing better or worst case worse than the non-treatment group. And there was even a bonus for the companies for participating in this experiment, a relatively large bonus, but apparently not large enough, because it was actually, although it was financed by the ministry, it had to be abandoned because not enough people actually participated in the treatment. No, people didn't really want the treatment, even though they were paid to get the treatment. And they got access to consultants that come out and help them interpret and stuff like that. So that's I would say that there's still a lot of work to be done analyzing whether these systems really help. We do believe they do help people to make better and more informed decisions, but we can't really prove it at this stage. We only have case studies to show that. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. There's some more links here if you want to go in and try these different systems we developed. You can also go in and use this advanced interactive benchmarking I showed you. You can read more here in these pages also. So I would like to books and pages, and so I just want to end here with stopping the presentation, then we can have some discussions if you have any questions. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening.